The virus may be reaching its peak, and the markets get their hopes up, at least for a day or two. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. Welcome back. Another week of the coronavirus, and the disease continues to spread and the death toll mounts. But this week, there was at least a glimmer of hope as numbers started to come down in Italy and in Spain, and even here in New York, they seem to plateau a bit. There's also a lot of damage being done to individuals and companies across the country. But again, maybe some hope because Congress appropriated $2 trillion in spending to try to help small businesses and individuals. But nonetheless, former Treasury Secretary Jack Lew warns that the economic damage will linger well past the time when we turn the corner on the health crisis.
I think it's quite clear that the economy is taking a very serious hit from this health crisis. And I think one of the things we know is that the economic impact will linger even after we turn the corner on the health crisis. It's going to take a while at best to turn the lights back on, and the government response really needs to be geared at maximizing the chance that we can restart in a smooth way. And that means making sure that people and businesses have what they need during the health crisis, but frankly, making sure that the assistance doesn't stop the minute we go out. A business is going to need money to pay its payroll. People aren't all going to go back to work. I think that, when you look at extending the benefits for businesses, it's very important to put more money in during the health crisis. It's also already time to start thinking about making sure that when they reopen, they still have the cash flow to support it. For state and local governments, they're going to lose revenue going into next year and even the year beyond. And the hole is far deeper than was filled the last time around. They need more stabilization money, and they need more matching money in Medicaid, more FMAP. Individuals are going to need some more assistance, and frankly, we're going to have to do a better job getting automatic payments to people who were left out the first time. People who are on SSI, people who don't file taxes, the legal children, American citizen children of non-citizens. A lot of people were left out. We need to close those gaps. And we need to increase food stamp benefits because that's going to make it possible for people to put food on the table. On top of that, we really need to worry about the rising problem of homelessness. People at the worst possible time are going to have no place to live, and there needs to be emergency assistance. On the business side, it's going to take a lot more money. It's also going to require that we find more ways to get flexibility into the program so that we lend to businesses that have not traditionally borrowed money from banks. That's very hard to do if you hold the bank to standards that apply in normal times, but these are not normal times.
Jack, talk to us about the efforts to really support small business right now. We have this $350 billion. There are reports that it's hard for some banks to loan the money because of some anti-money laundering provisions, some restrictions. Does it make sense to ease those up some? Is that a legitimate reason some banks are saying we can't deal with small businesses if we don't know them? It's the know your customer rule.
So there have been multiple levels at which the normal rules have to be modified or suspended. So with a federal guarantee, there's no credit risk to the banks, but they still have underwriting risk potentially, and they still have exposure on things like money laundering enforcement. On the underwriting side, if there's any kind of a false statement, that burden has to fall on the business that makes the false statement, and it can't be that the bank is facing after-the-fact oversight on that. If we're asking them to rely on certifications, we are not giving them the time to look behind the certifications that the businesses make. On the AML side, I think that they need to be creative and find a solution. Every business that has a bank account has gone through some kind of know your customer process. We need to make sure that any business that has a banking account can use the process they went through, whether it's at the bank they're borrowing from or not, to satisfy those KYC requirements. What we can't afford is we can't afford at the end of this to have failed to loan money to the smallest and most vulnerable businesses, the Main Street businesses that don't have a history of bank credit. So when the major banks and even the community banks say we're only going to lend to a business that we've already lent to, that rules out the businesses that are most likely to fail. And I believe deeply in enforcing things like anti-money laundering rules. So I'm not somebody who's ever been casual on this. I think we have to be creative to find a way to get through that hurdle.
Jack, there's talk about whether we need to top this up, so to speak, the small business, maybe another $250 billion. Is it time to do that right now and keep the money going out the door, or should we wait and see how it's proceeding, whether it's having an effect in the economy?
Well, I have to say that the whole need for response here is immediate in the sense that we shut the economy down. We need to make sure that these businesses are there when we open it back up. And if we take too much time to try to get things perfect, which is always my preference, I'd love to be able to say every I was dotted, every T was crossed. We will look back and regret it because there'll be so many business failures that the length of the recovery is extended, the depth of the recession is deepened, and the number of people unemployed lingers at a very high level. Half of American workers are working in small businesses, and we need them to be able to go back to work when the health conditions permit it. So I think time is of the essence. I thought that the funds that were put in this third bill were very helpful, but I didn't think it was adequate at the time when you just look at the number of businesses that are going to need help. So I'm not surprised that they're looking at providing some more assistance. What I'm trying to add into the thinking process and the comments I'm making is when the green light comes to open up, there has to be cash flow to reopen. So there's going to be a need to continue some of this assistance a little longer than the health crisis, just like there's going to be a need to help people who are on unemployment with extended benefits and food stamps, SNAP, and other kinds of assistance, as long as the economy is lagging behind because of the health crisis.
Jack, whatever we do, whatever more stimulus and spending there's done, the government's going to have to borrow an awful lot of money. We already have $2 trillion in the last spending package. That means a lot of issuance from the U.S. Treasury. Might that change the way issuance is done? For example, should we reconsider something like an ultra-long bond? Some people have even suggested maybe a war bond. As President Trump has said, we're at war with this virus. That's been used in prior wars. Should we be thinking about different sorts of issuance coming out of the U.S. Treasury?
I think we need to be open to be using the whole yield curve to finance this huge increase in debt in the most efficient way possible. I've never been persuaded that the 50-year bond is likely to have the kind of deep market that could be relied on. This feels like a dangerous time to run an experiment on a major scale with a new concept. We have very deep, very well-developed markets we can go long and short. And I think the demand for the U.S. debt will remain strong in the global economy that we're in as long as it is clear that we're responding to this crisis and that we have the resilience to bounce back. I think that the place where I am worried about the financial shortfall being crushing and without federal assistance there will be terrible consequences is at the state and local level. They operate, many of them, with balanced budget requirements. If they can't fill the holes in their budget because of sales tax revenue being off, because of gasoline tax revenues being off, and because of income taxes being off and delayed, they're going to start cutting back on vital services, and they're going to be canceling things like road programs, and that will have macroeconomic consequences. Overall, I've spent most of my career worrying, and I continue to worry about the long-term sustainability of our deficit and our debt. I do not believe that in this moment, if we are penny-wise and pound-foolish, it will be a good thing. We're going to need to spend what it takes to come out of this healthy, where the economic costs in the long run will be greater and the debt and deficit will be greater. As far as financing it goes, we need, I think, to be careful, as Treasury typically is, in going into markets to make sure that we maintain the depth and liquidity for what is an extraordinarily large increase in federal borrowing.
That was former Treasury Secretary Jack Lew. Coming up, he runs the hospital system at the center of the New York City crisis. We talk with Dr. Steve Corwin, CEO of York-Presbyterian.
In my hospital system, we have enough testing to test everybody that needs to be tested, but we're not at mass population screening.
This is Wall Street Week. Welcome back to Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. New York-Presbyterian is more than just a huge hospital on the east side of Manhattan. It actually incorporates 10 different hospitals in the area and over 200 clinics. We talked with the president and CEO, Dr. Steve Corwin, and we asked him whether he still thought that the disease might peak in the New York area around April 15th.
We are starting to see a little bit of flattening. So our best estimate is still right around that time. But hopefully I'm wrong, and that we see by Saturday a real trend in flattening. That would be certainly the first piece of welcome news in a while. So I'm hopeful.
And Dr. Corwin, how are the hospitals holding up? How's your hospital holding up? When we hear things from the governor like it's redlining, can you sustain the present level of activity for very long?
You know, I have to tell you that our staff has just been remarkable. We've redeployed 2,000 physicians, 1,000 nurses, 500 general workers. We've gotten 2,000 people to volunteer. We have pediatric nurses delivering ICU care. We have our chief of dermatology functioning in the emergency room. We have our chief of cardiothoracic surgery functioning as an ICU doc. People are just going to extraordinary lengths. It's really remarkable. How sustainable is it over the long haul? It's not. But we think we can pull through this crisis and that we're not going to break.
Well, that's very encouraging news. When you talk, Dr. Corbett, about redeploying people, I think you're talking within New York-Presbyterian. We also hear from Governor Cuomo a lot about redeploying physicians and nurses and other healthcare professionals among different hospitals as they reassign. Is that working well? Are you giving people to other people? Or are they giving them to you?
I'll give you a perfect example. One of our affiliated institutions, Hospital for Special Surgery, they stopped all their elective surgery. They've assigned a lot of their nurses and physicians to us, so that's an example of volunteerism. We've had people from around the country volunteer. We were on the phone yesterday with Mark Larrett from University of California, San Francisco. He's putting a team together for us. So the response around the country, the American spirit, has really been remarkable and very heartwarming for me.
And do you have a sense of how it's going in New Jersey, for example, our adjacent state here? They seem to be really still on their way up. Are they asking for help as well?
You know, David, I don't know the specifics in New Jersey. I know that Governor Murphy said yesterday that they were on the way up. What I hope is that no state goes through what New York City and its surrounding counties are going through now. And I would just urge everybody to recognize that these social isolation and stay-at-home orders have been effective. I know in California they've seen much less in the way of this than us here in New York City, and I think part of that may have been an earlier application of the stay-at-home that Governor Newsom did. And I'm hoping other states follow suit on that.
So, Steve, that really leads us naturally to the next question. And we want to be careful of this question because we don't want to declare victory too soon and go back to a bad old situation. But we are starting to talk about now a plan at some point in the right situation to start reopening some of the economy. How do we develop that plan? How do we make sure that we don't revert at the same time as we have to go forward?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. I think that the worst thing we could do would be to start prematurely and then lose the confidence of the American people and have to go back to where we are. And believe me, I recognize the millions of jobs, the recession that we most assuredly will enter, whole industries being stopped, the economy basically being stopped as a whole. I think that my expectation around this is that, on or around in the June or July timeframe, we're probably going to do some of that. The way that I would look at it from the personal situation in New York City is when I start seeing the decline and the return more towards normality, we're going to be in sort of phase two. Phase one being the upswing. phase 2 being we're still living with the virus, but it is more controllable than what it was. And then phase 3, probably, the third, fourth quarter, we're talking about can we get back to a more normal situation. I would say that what Dr. Fauci said really is ultimately where we have to be, which is a vaccine and treatment, because I think the virus is going to be with us for a while. I hope we don't have a recurrence or a recrudescence of a real spike in October. And you've seen that if you release these things too early, you get another spike and you're back to square one.
As we talk to experts about the possibility of reopening, the thing we hear again and again and again is testing. We have to know whether we really are controlling it sufficiently. Where are we in testing? It appears we are not to the level we need yet of broad testing across the population to really come back safely.
I don't think we certainly have enough testing. In my hospital system, we have enough testing to test everybody that needs to be tested. But we're not at mass population screening. That's with the PCR test. That's one type of testing. And the second type of testing that everyone's working on is the serologic testing or the antibody testing. Were you infected with it, and does that confer immunity on you? You're still looking at 90% of the population that probably has not been affected by it. So the question starts to become, do you get some herd immunity? Do we have evidence of that? Are we sure that if you've been infected and you have the antibodies, that you're not going to get reinfected with it? These are still scientific questions to be determined. But I think, to your question, we need more testing, the PCR testing. Do you have the virus or don't you have the virus? And we're going to need to apply the serologic testing to determine what percentage of the population actually was infected by it, and are we starting to develop herd immunity as a country?
That was Dr. Steve Corwin of New York-Presbyterian Hospital. Coming up, former Energy Secretary Bill Richardson on what to do about oil.
The states in the Southwest are dependent on a stable price of oil, and it's way down. I think the president and the administration should be careful there.
This is Wall Street Week. Welcome back to Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. Oil has been rocked by what the pandemic has done to demand. And then Saudi Arabia and Russia decided to have a price war. Bill Richardson has served as the New Mexico governor, as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and as U.S. Energy Secretary. And he has some very specific ideas about where the problem with oil lies.
The Saudis and the Russians both want to hurt our shale production. They don't like it that we're the number one domestic oil and gas producer. But at the same time, the Russian economy is hurting. The Saudis want to show that they're still viable when it comes to OPEC and price wars, and they've shown that. The Russian economy is hurting. The geopolitical side, the Russians want to help Iran. The Russians want to help Venezuela. Those two countries are suffering because of the price war. And I think the Saudis want stability, but they want most of all to hurt their big geopolitical rival, Iran.
So what about the point that's made by some members of OPEC that it's not fair for them to cut their production if the United States isn't cutting its production? Should we be willing in some way, shape, or form to go to the table and say, okay, in order for the good of the overall oil market, we'll sort of curtail our production as well?
Well, that's a problem for us. You take the oil patch. I'm from New Mexico, Texas. That's going to hurt us a lot. Our budgets in the states in the Southwest are dependent on a stable price of oil, and it's way down. I think the president and the administration should be careful there. I think they're playing it correctly right now, a little bit of a balance, but urging both Russia and Saudi Arabia to make a deal. And the key is, again, the Saudis, because they control 11 other countries that are part of OPEC. Russia has shown its muscle. I think both sides have gotten what they want. They should make a deal and stabilize global markets because of this virus issue, but international economic stability is dependent on a stable price of oil and gas.
What's the best way to get it resolved? Is it through OPEC Plus, as they call it, or is it actually at the G20? Because we have an OPEC Plus meeting coming up scheduled for Thursday, and now the G20 says they're going to have their energy ministers get together on Friday. Can G20 really work this out?
No, I think it has to be Russia and the Saudis with a push from OPEC countries, a push from the United States. I think both sides have lost a lot, Russia and Saudis, but they've demonstrated their muscle. It's time to make a deal. No, I don't think the G20, yes, they're players, obviously, the international economy, big guys, but I think it's a bilateral deal between Russia and China pushed by the United States and the other OPEC countries.
What about tariffs in the United States on oil? That's something that's been discussed as well. The president, in a meeting with energy leaders, said he didn't take that off the table. Do you think that would be a wise move?
No, it's not a wise move. I'm a free trader. You don't want to be protectionist. I think this administration, their tactics of maximum pressure on everybody, on 3M now for manufacturing the masks overseas instead of in the country. I think you use that as leverage, the Defense Production Act. Get our companies to work with us rather than go after them. So no, not tariffs. Let's have good-fashioned negotiation between Russia and China, pushed by OPEC. That's the best way to do it.
You mentioned 3M, and I'd like to pursue that in a broader sense here, because one of the issues, as I understand it, that President Trump had with 3M is that it was continuing to export, as it had in the past, masks, those N95 masks, to Canada. And he really wanted to clamp down on any export of masks. Apparently, Canada reacted very badly to that. What do you think, as a former governor, how do you think about the situation with maybe curtailing U.S. exports of critical PPE material overseas?
Well, I'm for curtailing them. I think we should take care of our own states, our own people, but it should be done in a negotiation, not by sanctions, not the way the administration wants to punish 3M, calling them disloyal. Yeah, I think they've got to change their priorities, 3M, but it should not be calling them disloyal to America. They're a good company. They're a big company. Let's work these out instead of just always maximum pressure, trying to find ways to punish rather than give them incentives, make them shift more to domestic production, but not necessarily through sanctions and calling them disloyal. I don't think that works.
And finally, Mr. Secretary, how is New Mexico faring as a practical matter? And specifically, where are you on the issue about how quickly we should be getting back to work? Because there seems to be a growing pressure here to say, as we plateau, at least here in New York, it appears we plateau. Maybe we should start thinking about how and when we start getting the economy going again.
Well, it shows once again that governors and states have more power than the federal government on these issues. My governor has been very aggressive and positive when it comes to dealing with the virus. But our economy is small. We're a tourism economy. We're an economy that is not terribly diverse, oil and gas. So we're dependent on international factors like the price of oil. This is why we want the economy to come back. I think it has to be a balance, but eventually, David, you have to choose between protecting your people and protecting your economy. And I think it has to be a balance, shifting a little bit towards protecting your people and their health.
That was former Energy Secretary Bill Richardson. Coming up, we're joined by Wall Street Week contributor Stephanie Flanders on what Europe needs to do to help its economy recover.
Of course, there's a massive hole in the European economy at the moment, and governments are doing their bit, trying to come up with ways to protect the economy as they go into these different forms of lockdown.
This is Wall Street Week. Welcome back to Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. It was difficult enough for the United States to adopt a sweeping economic package and to do it quickly. But Europe has 27 different governments who have to agree, something that is proving quite difficult to do. We spoke with Wall Street Week contributor Stephanie Flanders, and we asked her what exactly the European governments are doing.
Well, it's an interesting situation, David, because, of course, there's a massive hole in the European economy at the moment, and governments are doing their bit, trying to come up with ways to protect the economy as they go into these different forms of lockdown. But the immediate issue is not what we had in the Eurozone crisis, where governments can't borrow and they need help to borrow to support their economies. They have been able to borrow, and in part they have been able to do that quite easily because the European Central Bank has been standing behind saying it'll do whatever it takes. So it's interesting in a way because the conversations of the European finance ministers, in a sense, are a sideshow. It's like the European finance ministers wanting to get in on the act and involve themselves in the rescuing of the Eurozone economy. But there are still some pretty fundamental issues at stake, and there are some things they could do that would certainly help countries through this.
So, Stephanie, you raise a really interesting prospect here. If, in fact, the individual countries can borrow, and in part they can still do that because the ECB is backing them up by buying bonds, then why do they need an overall plan? Why can't they leave it up to the 27 countries to figure it out for themselves, as it were?
Well, in one sense, there's a political issue here that, you're the Eurozone, you're supposed to be in this together, and if there's this common threat, which you're all facing, and it's an enormous threat to their economies right now, you should be able to show that, working together, you can do more than working separately. So I think they would politically like to show that they're contributing to this effort. There is a proposal, for example, by the European Commission, so that would be for all of the European Union countries, to have a €100 billion loan scheme to help labour markets in different countries. They think that they can help the countries that don't have as greater capacity to borrow because they've already got high debt, like Italy. They think they probably can help. But I would say it to some extent is a political issue. And I think it's also about what kind of Eurozone you want going forward. Do you want the kind of Eurozone that has common funds, common support for countries? And of course, that's been a debate right from the beginning.
Well, and Stephanie, I wonder whether it's different in Europe than the United States because your social net there is so much stronger in many ways than the United States. I mean, you actually have unemployment support. You have health care. A lot of countries have universal health care. Maybe the pressures are somewhat different from what we face in the United States with millions upon millions of people being put out of work.
Well, it is an observation that people have made that maybe some of the features of the European economy that have been criticized all these years when they've been said to be sclerotic because they have inflexible labor markets. It's hard to lay people off. And they have these really big welfare states that take up a lot of the economy. In this particular instance, where you want the government actually to be stepping in to be that insurance policy for everyone who's just been seen their business disappear, there are some advantages to having those sclerotic systems. It's harder for companies to lay people off, so that more people might stay in work through this crisis. And it's also, if they do lose their jobs, of course, there's more of a safety net to catch them. But I don't think governments are being complacent about that. I mean, they still know that they need to come up with some ideas here that they haven't had to do before. Lots of countries have now done, for example, what the UK suggested, which is the guarantee to pay a certain chunk of salaries for companies to stop people being laid off. And I think that could end up being very expensive, but could play a big role in just making sure there is still that economy there once you decide to switch it back on.
So, Stephanie, one of the things that people over in the United States like to follow is the supposed debate, even contest between Germany, the northern countries on one hand, and the southern countries such as Italy on the other about a coronavirus bond, a euro bond overall. Is that overblown, or is that a very big division that could interfere with really addressing the problems in the economy there?
Yeah, and actually in this case, and one of the reasons why it has been so hard for the European finance ministers to agree this week is because there's quite a big divide, particularly actually the Netherlands, which tends to be, if you like, more German than the Germans in its approach to this, don't want the Eurozone to be a way for what they consider to be overspending, feckless countries to get away with more irresponsible behavior, kind of running up a tab for other countries that are more responsible, like the Netherlands or Germany. And that has always been an issue. How much are we going to pool our sovereignty when it comes to borrowing money and taking responsibility for that when we're part of the Eurozone? Italy, the Italian government, has been arguing to have that kind of Eurozone debt, a form of corona bond potentially, issued in this instance to give them more capacity to spend on this common threat, to give the Eurozone more capacity to spend that Italy wouldn't have on its own. But the Netherlands and indeed to some extent Germany are saying, hang on, we still haven't seen you reduce your debt level. We still think you're pretty risky. We don't particularly want to borrow along with you. So that is a continued debate. It's been right at the heart of the Eurozone, never really resolved. But we are perhaps inching a little bit more in that direction with this crisis because it is such a common threat.
That was Wall Street Week contributor Stephanie Flanders. Coming up, she's the woman working side by side with Governor Andrew Cuomo in the battle at the epicenter of the crisis. We talked with Kathy Hochul, Lieutenant Governor for the state of New York.
We're constantly redeploying resources to make sure that the hospitals can handle the surge in their area and leaving no area unprotected.
That's next on Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. Welcome back to Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. New York has the highest number of cases and the highest number of deaths from the coronavirus. But this week, there were some data coming in that indicated it may be plateauing. We asked Lieutenant Governor for New York, Kathy Hochul, whether in fact this may be a trend.
We went from 53,000 hospital beds when this crisis started to, because of the governor's aggressive efforts to increase capacity and get assistance from the federal government, we now have 90,000 beds available. But those beds don't mean anything if you don't have enough staff and supplies. On the staffing front, as predicted, our superhero frontline individuals who are in there taking care of the sick and people in the ICUs in particular, they are also succumbing. Many of them are becoming ill, and they've been away from their families for a long time, and there's a probably high burnout, but they keep going at it once and again and again and again. But now we have a reserve of 7,000 people who've been hired from the incredible outpouring of volunteers from all over this country. 7,000 people have been hired by hospitals recently because they stepped up. Many of them had been retired, and people from all over America. So we feel good about that part. The supplies, the governor would say that we have no hospital is going for a ventilator, which is so important, but that's also a concern of ours because any spike in a particular region could require even a higher intense number of ventilators. Look at what's happening in Suffolk County, for example, on Long Island or Nassau County. They need ventilators more than they did even a week ago, and so we're constantly redeploying resources to make sure that the hospitals can handle the surge in their area and leaving no area unprotected. That's been our goal all along.
So, Lieutenant Governor Hochul, we hope at or nearing at least the apex, and so we're very much in the crisis, and we don't know, as Governor Cuomo said, what's on the other side of that. And so we don't want to get ahead of ourselves, as you said. We don't want to encourage people to really go out and do away with social distancing. But it's not too soon for the government to start thinking about when and how we even think about starting to get back to work. Are you working on what that plan looks like? Obviously, we're not going to just let everybody go. It has to be staged. Is there a plan being developed for New York?
Absolutely. And what the governor and I agree with is that it also comes down to testing. We don't want to declare that it's safe for people to go back to work unless we can test and find out. Certainly the first wave of people would be people who've already had the coronavirus and overcame it and are now healthy again, and people who've developed the antibodies. But we're only going to know for sure if we can have widespread testing, which, because of a number of issues with the federal government early on and a lack of testing capacity, as well as just the basic supplies, the swabs you need, the reagents you need, we've had a shortage of those. But if we can get the federal government to ramp up production of these necessary supplies so we can have rapid testing, I mean, there are opportunities for us to have a result literally in a doctor's office in 5 minutes, 15 minutes, a half an hour, depending on the type of materials used. But we have to get to that point in order for us to feel confident that we're just not having a downward trend that's going to spike up again, as has happened when we study past pandemics, certainly the 1918 Spanish flu. We don't want to end up with a 6-month phenomenon, which is what happened there, and we lost 60,000 New Yorkers. We have been very proactive in preventing that scenario because of the steps Governor Cuomo has taken, and other states are following our lead, and we're proud of that. But we also have to talk about what it's going to take to get individual industries back. But in addition to that, David, I have been focused as chair of all the state regional economic development councils overseeing economic development. I've already been in contact with the statewide chambers of commerce, regional representatives from the industries, manufacturing, and others, talking about how we jumpstart the economy once we start going full steam ahead. Because there'll be a lot of businesses, a lot of small businesses in particular, that just may not make it. if they can't get the assistance they need from the federal government, they need a lifeline now, or they're gone forever. And all the work that we've done in the state to reduce unemployment, to increase jobs, to have more investments in economic development, we don't want to lose where we've gone. So I'm already thinking about that and having the conversations literally as we speak.
Critically important. One last question, specifically on testing. Do you have a sense of how far we are away in terms of time to have the required testing to really make the move to start opening up?
No, we just don't have the capacity yet. And if we could get the federal government to invoke the Defense Production Act and have widespread testing materials created, we'd be in a much better place.
That was New York Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul. Coming up on Wall Street Week, we wrap up the week with Rick Reeder of BlackRock and our special contributor, Larry Summers. This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. Welcome back to Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. One of the big events of the week, maybe the big event of the week, was that massive infusion from the Federal Reserve as they touched upon almost every aspect of the economy and markets. We talked with Rick Reeder from BlackRock, where he is the global CIO for fixed income as well as head of cross-asset allocation. We talked to Rick Reeder and we asked him whether the markets were actually overreacting to what the Fed had to do. This is what Rick had to say.
The markets, you could debate are the markets overshooting. I mean, you think about the day they had, like you said, what the Fed did is a ripple through the market. I mean, parts of the high yield market and credit markets, it's a virtual tidal wave of the impact that it's having. Markets tend to overshoot, but I think when this is a very, very unique circumstance, it's different than '08, different than maybe any other crisis, in that we do think the economy is going to rebound. And we do think, we think you could have a second quarter that is something like an annualized run rate of 30% decline in the economy. But we think third quarter, 12% up, fourth quarter, you get 8% up. And then next year, we're going to have the stimulus will still be working through the system. You'll have a pretty good GDP number. We think over 5% the year after. So, listen, I think the markets are right. The markets shouldn't go back to where they were. But you're getting closer to factoring in the what's happened and this immense amount of stimulus that I think the markets are rightfully adjusting to.
So Rick, how is the way you put money to work today different than it was yesterday, given what the Fed's done? As an investor, what does an investor do today that they wouldn't have done yesterday, or vice versa?
It's a big deal. I mean, we are, if you go back a day, 24 hours ago. The way you thought about, if you were a AAA asset because the Fed was getting at that, if you were a high quality, that you were in good shape. If you were investment grade bondholder, credit holder, you were in pretty good shape because the Fed was there, certainly in mortgages. But you've now extended this, and that the high yield market, it's definitely supportive of companies, not just the high yield market, but a lot of the BBB companies that are going to go into high yield. That those actually become a lot safer. The CLO market or the loan market generally, with the Fed providing what is functionally, not to get too technical around what's happened, but the Fed going into that CLO market, the AAA part of the CLO market, lifts a lot of what was blockage in the system around loans. So that gives you a lot more comfort. And, quite frankly, I think the equity market reacts to what is stable financial conditions and a bridge from here to there, and so to take on some more equity risk, I think is makes some sense. And we're doing, I think, like a lot of people, we've been running high levels of cash in our portfolios, and because the uncertainty was so great, given how much stimulus is coming in from fiscal as well as the monetary side, you can take a little bit of that cash. You still should run high levels of cash, but you can spend some of that money even in the markets that you were less willing to do it a day ago.
That was Rick Reeder of BlackRock. And now we wrap up our week, as we do every week, with our very special Wall Street Week contributor, Larry Summers of Harvard. And of course, he was a former Secretary of the Treasury. Welcome back, Larry. Let's get a sense of exactly where we are, not just today, but look around the corner a little bit. What are the next turns in this crisis as far as we can discern them? We hear the Fed did something really good for the markets. At the same time, we also heard this week so many tenants, for example, not being able to pay their April rent.
I think what the Fed did is surely right for the short run. I think it's a mistake always to think that the provision of liquidity can override fundamentals, and that lending money can fill fundamental gaps. We're having no revenue effectively for a large number of retail establishments. We're having no revenue for many landlords, residential landlords. We don't know how this is going to play out. Tenants aren't going to pay landlords. In many cases, Staples, for example, said not going to pay landlords at all. What about landlords? Landlords are all levered way up. Are they going to pay banks? If they don't pay banks, are banks going to be able to meet their liabilities given the depletion of their capital? How's that going to end? The Fed can make a lot of loans, and then somebody can decide where the seniority of those loans is relative to other claims. But a substantial part of this is surely going to end up back on taxpayers, and there may well be some very substantial uncertainties along the way. So I don't think this is resolving problems. This is postponing problems, and we're going to see how they get dealt with over time. I'm not sure what the answer is going to be.
As a practical matter, do we have to have a massive bankruptcy across the country? I mean, already bankruptcy lawyers are being called up left, right, and center because this is going to go through pretty much the entire economy, it feels like.
We're going to need a large amount of restructuring of debts, whether that's going to take place through bankruptcy, whether that's going to take place through negotiations in the shadow of possible bankruptcy, whether that's going to take place by the government taking on the debts and then forbearing on collection indefinitely. I don't know how that's going to work out, but there's going to need to be the mother of all debt workouts.
Right.
The kind of thing that we saw in the financial sector in 2008, we're going to be seeing over very large parts of the real economy, and that's going to bounce back into the financial sector. So this mother of all workouts is going to play out for a substantial period of time, even if the recovery is as rapid as Rick Reeder hopes, and I'm not sure that's going to actually play out.
And Larry, what about the virus itself and our fight against the virus? And we've had some encouraging signs, some initial encouraging signs. At the same time, people are really talking already about getting back to work. What is that process going to look like from your point of view?
Look, I think the grisly metaphor that's right for this is physical isolation is chemotherapy, and the goal is remission. And you can apply chemotherapy and you can achieve remission. The problem is that chemotherapy is toxic and increasingly toxic over time. And when you let up on the chemotherapy, you can lose the remission. The hope is that we're going to be able to let up on the physical isolation. And when we do that, we're going to put in some testing and some tracing of contacts, and then we're all going to be able to live in a pretty normal way. I hope that's the story prior to a vaccine, and that a vaccine comes fast. But I think we'll be doing very well if it's a year from now when we've got everybody vaccinated, and I think it's more likely to be 18 months from now, though I hope I'm wrong. And I think that if you look at the Asian success stories, they are a little less optimistic when probed closely. Singapore has already lost its remission and had to go to lockdown. No one really knows what the situation would be if you had externally observed and collected data in China. In Taiwan, which has been a success so far, they seem to have a essentially total remission. Every time you walk into an office building, they make you take your temperature and they make you apply hand sanitizer. The government's able to track everybody's movements, so that if a week ago you were in a restaurant at the same time that somebody who came down with the virus, you can be moved into quarantine immediately. Those are going to be challenging things to do in our country, and if we fall short, then we're at much more risk of relapse. So my guess is that it's going to be a little less freed up and back to normal when this current wave ends than people think, and that there's going to be a greater risk of rebound and back to lockdown and a kind of accordion dynamic till we get to the point where a vaccine or cure comes along. I hope I'm wrong, and it's certainly possible that I will be. Earlier, I thought that if the health situation was under control, you could have a fairly rapid recovery of the kind that you have when a resort town comes back for the summer. And I still think that's right. I just don't think it's relevant, because I think the virus is going to be a very substantial overhang until we get to the point where we have a vaccine. And so the question is going to be this remission chemotherapy dynamic, and we're going to be managing it at least for the next year.
And it puts a lot of pressure on the competence question that you've raised before. The question is whether we really are competent to do that.
It certainly does. It certainly does, David. And there's a lot of very good, very energetic, very capable work being done at the micro level on the ground in hospitals and communities all across the country. Whether there is that level of competence in the overall strategic planning, whether there could be, given the way we've allowed our public institutions to atrophy, is, I think, a very real question.
Great question. Thank you so much to Larry Summers, our Wall Street Week contributor. That does it for Wall Street Week for this week. I'm David Westin. We hope you'll join us next week. This is Bloomberg.